As Jeff Cable, I'm in my backyard and it's nighttime. I decided to shoot this at night because tonight we're gonna be talking about night photography. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I wanna share with you some of the tips and tricks on how to get a great night shot. So let's talk about some of my favorite tips so that you can get some great shots at night. First of all, a couple things you need. You need a good tripod that's sturdy and stable so that there's no shaking of the camera. You want to either use your timer on the camera or a trigger so that you're not actually touching or shaking the camera at all by even hitting the shutter button, because even that little bit of movement can mess up a good long exposure. My favorite time to shoot is what we call the blue hour. And this is just after the sun sets, but before it gets pitch black. And that's when you get that deep blue in the sky. It's so much better than shooting when you have that pitch black. If you look at this image here, this is the San Francisco Bay Bridge at night when it's really dark. And this image here is of the San Francisco Bay Bridge taken during the blue hour or sunset. Totally different shot. Much better when you don't have all that kind of muddy black in the background. Typically when I'm shooting night shots, I'm using live view on the camera, and I'll go in and I'll magnify at 10x on the camera, so I'm zoomed way into the cityscape or whatever I'm shooting, and I'll manually focus to make sure that it's tack sharp on the buildings that I'm photographing, and this makes sure that I have proper focus even in low light. One trick that I use quite a bit when I'm doing night photography, and a lot of people don't know about this, is I'll turn the camera to a -1 exposure comp, which means I'm darkening the image in the camera. What I find, at least with the Canon 5D Mark III and 5D Mark IV, is when I'm doing night shots, they tend to overcompensate for the darkness, and they tend to blow out the highlights. So I'll set the camera at -1 to protect the highlights, and I can always bring them back a little bit in Photoshop when I'm doing post-production. When I'm doing my night shots, I like to use a really narrow aperture, something like f11 or f16, which makes the exposures longer, but also gives me starburst effect. Again, in this image here, you can see that the lights are actually giving me a starburst. That's not from a filter. That's actually coming from the fact that I'm shooting at f16. So shooting at a low aperture or a high aperture number gives me that starburst effect. The other advantage of shooting with a really long exposure is that it'll neutralize water. So if I'm shooting over a lake, a river, or an ocean, or a bay, when I'm shooting over water, having a long exposure will neutralize the ripple effect and give me reflections like you're seeing in this image, where it really stands out. Now, you don't see this with the human eye, but when you have a long shutter and it neutralizes all the waves, you'll get reflections off the water like you see here. When you're doing your night photos, you can actually use your white balance on the camera to make the sky bluer or yellower. I tend to leave it in auto white balance, and I'll adjust the white balance later when I'm doing the final retouching in Photoshop. And you'll see that with this image here, where I've got a little bit of the blue side showing. It's a little bit cooler than maybe it was when I was shooting, but it brings out the blues in the sky, and I really like that. Another technique I really like when I'm doing night photography is to roll the zoom during the exposure. So what you do, let's say you have an 8-second exposure, you could roll the zoom for a couple seconds during the beginning, let it sit there for a couple seconds, and then roll at the end of the exposure. Or you could try rolling all the way through the exposure to see what you get. And it's fun to zoom in, zoom out that way, and just kind of see what the effect is. And who knows, you might come up with something really cool. I really like this shot of Golden Gate Bridge. And I really like this shot here of Red Square in Russia. Unfortunately, when I decided to roll the zoom on this, it had already gotten past the blue hour and it was into kind of that black, muddy night sky. If I had to do all over again, I would have done this roll in the zoom shot when it was still the blue hour. But I missed that opportunity. I love night photography, and I hope that you try this because it's harder to do, but the results you can get are really, really fun and colorful and interesting. If you go to places like the Sydney Opera House, you'll see tons of daytime shots, but rarely do you see a really good night shot. So you're up for the challenge, take it, make some great shots for yourself.